Today we're going to have a very architecturally driven class. First of all, we're going to look at specifically domestic architecture at the turn of the 20th century, and then we're going to talk about our most architecturally driven movement of the early 20th century, which is the German movement of Bauhaus. But we're going to start with an American architect, and an architect with an incredibly long career of over 70 years. And he's an architect who has designed every type of building almost that we can imagine. He designed hotels and churches, gas station, a synagogue, an art museum, banks, businesses, and specifically homes. And so I did want to think a little bit about domestic architecture, which means really how we think about houses. Now, before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright. He is an American architect. He is born in Wisconsin. His mother decided from the time he was young that he was predestined to be this fantastic architect and a builder. And he actually went to the University of Wisconsin to start studying architectural drafting and to learn the basics of architecture. But he ended up quitting school. He sold some of his father's books to his parents were divorced, to raise some money, and he ended up going to Chicago in the 1880s. Now, this is an interesting idea. There was a very bad fire, the Chicago fire in 1881. And so Chicago was sort of this modern city that was also like a blank slate, a tabula rasa. So many buildings had been destroyed that it became really a center of modern American architecture. And there he got a job working in the firm of Louis Sullivan, who was the most famous architect in the city. And he was himself a revolutionary. Sullivan was one of these architects in the late 19th century who completely bucked the system of what architects were supposed to be doing. He was working at a time when the most popular kind of architecture was sort of Greek revival. You know, you put columns in front of everything. You made everything look sort of vaguely classical, like Washington, D.C. But Sullivan was interested in this idea of an American architecture, and he designed some of the earliest skyscrapers. And by the way, skyscrapers were really at the end of the 19th century only becoming a possibility, not only because they were needed, this is the time of the rise of the American city, but also because of new technologies like stronger building materials and elevators made skyscrapers possible. Sullivan was famous for the mantra form follows function. And that's going to be something that we'll think about a little bit today when we look at architecture. In any case, Wright only worked for Sullivan for a short period of time, and he ends up getting fired because Wright started moonlighting and designing houses for some of Sullivan's wealthy clients. And so now we think of Wright more as a house builder. Now, Wright is a fascinating person. He was a wild self-promoter. He said he was the greatest architect who ever lived. And he had a really interesting, scandal-filled personal life that went through a number of marriages and mistresses and mayhem. So you really, if you're ever interested, read about Frank Lloyd Wright's personal life. And there is a fantastic series of interviews that were done with him in the middle of the 20th century towards the end of his life that record some wonderful stories. But okay, let's talk about the idea of the house. Now I'm putting up just a picture of sort of generic house because I wanted to ask you, what do you think of when you think of a house? What are its characteristics? And if I just had you pick up a pen or pencil and draw a house, most of us end up drawing this box-like shape with the triangular roof and the chimney, a door in the front and in the center, and then usually some symmetrically placed windows on either side. Like we have our sort of simplified idea of what is house. And so what's interesting about Wright is that he begins to design a group of houses that he called prairie houses. And he built about 139 of these prairie houses, mostly in the suburbs of Chicago. And so he set out to say he wanted to create this, what he called an architecture of democracy. And he had this idea that people literally lived better. They were better if they lived in the right environment. Ha, right. But that's, that's like a joke. So let's take a look at one of his prairie houses to see what characteristics we expect in a house that maybe we're not going to find. And so I begin with the Roby House of 1908. And again, this is in the suburbs of Chicago. You could see it's really right now part of sort of like a suburban neighborhood. I had a chance to go to the Roby House once. I didn't make it inside. I was in Chicago running around on my way to the airport, and I did not know that it was such a long wait to get in there. But okay, let's look at this building right away and see what it is that subverts our expectations. So let's say we said that we were expecting to see a sort of rectangular or squarish house. And by that, we would mean sort of solid plains and walls with the triangular roof. And we see neither of these things. We also don't see a front door, right? And it's also quite unexpected on a sort of suburban lot. Now, most of us live on parcels of land, and how do we tend to build? With a smallish footprint, and then we build multiple stories so that we preserve a lawn. And you see that we don't have that in Wright's building. So, okay, the walls are gone, and instead we have a series of these long horizontal planes. Right? You could see this horizontal band, this horizontal band. Everything is very low and horizontal, anchored around this one central element that's vertical, which is the chimney, and everything else just sort of juts off from it. Now, horizontal is an interesting word here. Sometimes Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture is talked about as having to do with naturalism, meaning that Wright adjusted the building based on the site he was building on. So for Wright, the building echoed its setting. It didn't stand apart from it. And those are two different ways you think about building. You can build a building to blend in where it is, or you can build it to stand apart from where it is. And so for him, the flat suburban plain required a low, flat building. And again, not what we would expect. And certainly it doesn't preserve any sense of lawn or the exterior. But Wright was very interested in this sort of modern life. If you go back to earlier you go back before cars, right? The idea is that people spent a lot more time walking. And so the porch became the social space of the house. You sat on the porch and people came by. By the way, I still do that at my house. I sit on the front steps and I see people come by. We have a walkie kind of neighborhood. But Wright was thinking about the age of the car. He was very interested in cars and machinery and technology. So this is a house that reflected the new idea of modern life, which was focused on the interior rather than the exterior. This is no more about walking culture. So you're going to notice something very interesting here, which is that we don't really see a solid plane of a wall, and we don't really see the front door. So to find the front door, we actually need to walk around that left side of the building. And instead, the entrance is here, down this walkway, down a ramp. So you go sort of it's very hard to see with the photographs, under this sort of overhang. It feels like a garage door, but very close to the top of your head. And so the idea is you're sort of forced almost into an underground feeling before you're relieved by coming up into the space of the interior. Now, you can notice, by the way, this different angle here, and we're a little bit closer, about his use of materials. Just like he thought the design of the house should fit the environment, so should the material. And so he chose this reddish brick material, which was, very much related to the sort of natural clay and the earth of its setting. So this is a sort of natural local brick. Now, from this angle, you can also see, though, that even though this building looks like it's a brick building, and again, this is a sense of naturalism, that there's actually more technology involved here. So if you'll notice, for example, there's no one single roof like we expect in a modern house or in a house. Instead, just like we have no solid wall, we don't have one single roof. We have it's like the roof is broken into different planes and they're shifting. And you'll notice here that the roof hangs way out over the walls, and that is what we call a cantilever. And that's a cantilever is when the supports aren't at the corners, they're pushed back. Now that tells you that even though Wright is building out of materials that look really traditional, he's actually a very modern architect. He can only build that way because he's using steel reinforced concrete. It's just that it's masked under this idea of sort of natural, sort of old-fashioned, low-tech materials. A note, you can see here his windows, which go all the way around, and again, these very horizontal bands. Just like Wright was playing with the notion of the walls as not being one solidly defined form, like in other words, inside and outside sort of interpenetrate. If you're under this overhang, are you inside or outside? Where exactly are the limits of the house? The windows work the same way. Wright thought about every little detail of the house. And so for him, the windows, if they opened up the way a lot of our windows do, you slide your hands under and you lift up, that reinforces the plane of the wall because the window is like the wall. It's this vertical plane separating inside from outside. So all of Wright's windows would open, they would crank out, breaking that plane and making us question where the limits of the house are. Now, Wright, when I say he chooses everything very carefully, oh my gosh, he made your furniture, he designed the dress that the lady of the house wore to her housewarming party. He chose these bricks. These were not just simple commercial made bricks. He had them specially made. Now I'm showing you an up close detail in black and white, but you can see the bricks are very long and extra thin, like they're very short, super horizontal bricks to emphasize that horizontal shape of the house. And then you can see, in order to emphasize that horizontal nature, the vertical joins where there's mortar between the bricks, that mortar was dyed the same color as the brick, and it was filled in so that you didn't see the division and it looked like a big long brick. And then he gouged out the mortar underneath and above each brick so that you could see this very horizontal layered effect of the building. And that too was by design. So we could step back one more time now, and now we see all of this in motion, right? We could see the interpenetrating planes, you could see the horizontal nature, you could see all these medium, you could see where he's using some exposed concrete, but again, mostly what we see is brick. So let's go look at the inside. Now, I said that Louis Sullivan's motto was form follows function, and Wright had a similar model, though he begins to change it. He says form follows function. That has been misunderstood. Form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. So he's thinking when he designs something about how everything works. And as I said, he designed everything. You could see from the inside that we've got the windows are actually designed in sort of Art Deco stained glass. He designs the furniture, the carpeting, the layout of the furniture. And again, he was very particular about all these details, even though he thought architecture was the art form, which is more important than the other art forms. So everything was subordinate to it. But once again, all these parts were related. Now, even though I say he looks in some ways, old-fashioned, like brick building, he's very modern because he's using reinforced steel. His buildings were also reinforced concrete. He's also using a lot of technology. So at a time when not all buildings had it, all of his buildings have electric lights. They had sort of forced hot air, so preconditioned, early versions of heating the home. And so, again, he was thinking in a very modern way. Garages are also a feature in all of his houses at a time when not everybody had a car, but the garage was part of this sort of modern experience. By the way, he became friends. First of all, he overspent on all of these houses because of his attention to detail. So the houses all came in over budget. It caused a lot of problems between him and his clients. And if he did come back to visit you after he built your house and you moved the furniture, he would put it back. Now here you can see a plan of the building. just because I wanted you to get a sense that Wright was sort of a proponent of this sort of very open plan. So rooms weren't meant to be individual cubicles. The space, just like the inside and outside interpenetrate, the same thing happens on the inside. So there's no real boundaries between private and public spaces. The central space of the house was the chimney. That really was the anchor of everything, was the hearth. That became the new social space of the house. You can see that's where the stairs are going to the lower level, but it's the fireplace, which is, sort of central to the living room and dining room. He cared more about the public spaces of the house. The private spaces of the house were smaller, like bedrooms, and you were given very little storage because he said that it really was, a place where you put things that you didn't want and you didn't need. Right? Again, it is this idea that you live better in Wright's house. So if you're not going to divide and sort of organize the furniture by walls, you organize and design it and organize it by furniture. So as I said, the furniture was very important to Wright. And I'm just showing you another picture of the interior of the Roby house. And also showing you a view of the dining room where you could see his dining room table. And I'm showing you some details of these terribly uncomfortable looking dining room chairs. But you could see the way they mimic the design of the house. The dining room table is cantilevered with the supports, sort of table sort of overhanging. You could see the furniture itself becomes almost like a screen in the room. Like it almost functions to organize the space and sort of define it in a way walls normally would. So while we're thinking about architecture, it'd be good to talk about our first sort of architecturally focused movement, which is the German movement. It's not really even a movement as much as it was actually a art school, although it's been very influential in a much wider circle, which is called Bauhaus. Now, just to put this in context, Bauhaus opens in 1918 in Weimar, which was the capital of post-war Germany. And this is a very tumultuous time. It's unstable. There's the financial troubles of the government. There's a new government. There was the influenza outbreak. So amidst all of this turmoil comes a new art school. Okay, so there's an architect named Walter Gropius, and he was basically asked to revive and direct the Weimar School of Industrial Art, which had been founded in 1908. So there was this like 10-year-old school, that had been sort of neglected during the war, and he's put in charge of it and asked to revitalize it. Now, Gropius, as background, had trained as an architect. He, originally trained as a draftsman, but he was not terribly good at that. But he did study as an architect for a few years, and then he ended up serving in World War I on the front lines. So he comes out of World War I with this very idealized attitude about art, the idea that art could lead to social betterment, and that art could be a way to help guide society towards a more idealized, political harmony. Gropius wrote this about these sort of utopian principles. He said, together let us conceive and create the new building of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity, and which will rise one day toward heaven from the hands of a million workers like a crystal symbol of a new faith. So he's put in charge of this school, and he ends up merging two different schools, the Academy of Fine Arts, which was called the Kunstschule, and the School of Applied Arts, which was the Kunstgewerbeschule. And he merges them together and he renames it the Bauhaus, which apparently the term, it just means like Bau is to build. So it's like a building house, but it apparently comes from the term Bauhütte, which was the name for a stonemason's lodge. And that relates to the sort of medieval tradition of building and the idea of the cathedral workshop. In other words, in medieval times, what architects usually built in stone were big churches and cathedrals. And so this was like the workman's house. And so it gives rise to this notion of a collaborative, communal medieval approach, which is what Gropius was trying to bring back. Now, you saw from that quote that I read to you, where he talked about architecture, sculpture, and painting in one unity. What he's really referring to was the tradition of the art academy. Art academies in the earliest 20th century were still a lot like the art academies of the 17th century. By that we meant art academies were places for high art, which is painting, sculpture, architecture, and artists, even though some of them practiced multiple disciplines, there were strict divisions between those disciplines. You were one of those things. Now, there were other kinds of art, like printmaking and photography and other kinds of, applied arts and design. Those things were sort of considered low art. Those were separate from fine art. And even in modern times, those weren't a part of the art academy. You went to study the noble arts of painting, sculpture, architecture. Those other things were hands-on things. So what Bauhaus sought to do was to sort of merge these things together. You merge the fine arts with the so-called crafts. In fact, that is something that Bauhaus said. There is no essential difference between the artist and the craftsman. And what's important there is he didn't just mean that artists and the craftsmen work together. He meant they were the same. Right? That one person has to be all of these things. So he was trying to break down the boundaries between those things. He said all people should be craftspeople first. And he was a big believer, and Bauhaus was, in learning by doing. So this is, I'll read you one more passage. This is the first proclamation of the Bauhaus. Architects, painters, and sculptors must recognize anew the composite character of a building as an entity. Art is not a profession. There is no essential difference between the artist and the craftsman. The art is an exalted craftsman. Together let us conceive and create the new building of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity. And we read that part before. In any case, he also was very much interested towards modernism, towards machinery. So even though there is this allusion to the craftsperson and the guild, he's also very interested in mass production and technology. Now, although Bauhaus is formulated, it lives in Weimar, there was a new government elected in 1924 that was more conservative and hostile to Bauhaus. And so Bauhaus ends up moving to the city of Dessau in 1925. It was a more welcoming place to the socialist leanings of the group. It had a larger population that was more politically liberal. It also was a more important industrial center. They had not only coal mining, but they had other sorts of industry, and Bauhaus was very sympathetic to that and very much related to industry itself. They also got more funding when they moved to Dessau, which allowed them to take some of their former students and turn them into instructors, and we'll talk about some of the instructors at Bauhaus. But it also allowed them to create a new campus, a new building for their school, and this is what we're looking at here. So I'm showing you the Bauhaus, and this was really sort of like the architectural manifesto for the school. Now I will say something, even though they began as this very integrated arts and crafts and all arts sort of are intertwined, they become much more architecturally focused when they move to Dessau, and they have all their students complete training in engineering. But they did, Gropius, he published quite a bit. They had a print shop at the school, and so the ideas of Bauhaus were disseminated by publications. Not only that, the students designed the magazines, they, did the typography and advertising. So it was a way to spread the principles of the school. And Gropius explained, we want to create a clear, organic architecture whose inner logic will be radiant and naked, unencumbered by lying facades and trickeries. We want an architecture adapted to our world of machines, radios, and fast motor cars, an architecture whose function is clearly recognizable in the relation of its form, with the increasing strength of new materials, steel, concrete, glass, and with the new audacity of engineering, the ponderousness of the old methods of building is giving way to a new lightness and airiness. So you can see, I mean, going back to what Louis Sullivan had said when he designed skyscrapers and said form follows function, they say the same thing, that function and form here are intertwined. A building should express what it does. And like Sullivan had said, and we'd also seen in Wright, there was this idea of stripping away extraneous detail and sort of getting down to the basics. So the goals of their architecture, not only we see this idea of architecture and machinery and technology being united, but they wanted the buildings to be built of basic forms and colors, sort of universally understandable, and simplicity, sort of in a sense of economy in their use of space and materials. Now, you're actually looking at two separate wings of the Bauhaus. In between the two, you can see this bridge, which had some of the administrative buildings. And then you could see the separation of sort of more the dormitory space on one side and then the workshop on the other. Now the dormitory space, I'm actually showing you pictures of the students below. They all had there were 28 separate flats, apartments that had balconies for the students. The dormitory building had a flat roof on the top with a rooftop garden with a sort of a waterproof coating on it, which proved to be inadequate. It didn't work. The building leaked. But you could see the way that building is designed differently than the workshop. You could see that, again, form reflects function. You could see the individual units and the sort of building broken up, and in a way that you don't see that here, that this is meant to be much more of an open space, and that is how the workshop was designed. In both of these cases, we are talking about technology. So these are made out of a reinforced concrete skeleton. And we know that Frank Lloyd Wright was also using reinforced concrete, although he masks it with brick. But this is reinforced concrete skeleton, and the floors were made of hollow tiles that were rested on the beam. And then we have this wall of glass. So like we saw in Wright, you have these sort of idea of the flat roof and these long interrupted planes, sort of horizontal planes, but here you can see the starkness of these long rows of windows and these long planes of these white walls, this very sort of simplistically arranged architecture. And when you look at the video that I posted on Stijl, you'll see the relationship between Gropius and modern art movements as well. So here we can I'm showing you the shop, what we call the shop block. It was that building on the right, which had the workshops in it. And I put a photograph on the bottom right corner of what the interior actually looked like. So whereas the architecture, obviously, of the sort of dormitory building was broken up into units, here the rooms were these big, wide open spaces. And that fit with the philosophy of Bauhaus, that all of these different kinds of arts were working together. Well, because of the new technology of steel reinforced concrete, different building principles, the architects could create these very wide open spaces. And again, that is reflected on the outside by this wall of glass. So here you could see the interior. They had two different kinds of sort of broad curriculum, different kinds of classes at Bauhaus. There were really that were focused on, craft, the manufacture, and the other ones that were focused more on form and design. By the way, the entire structure of the Bauhaus, first of all, the school of the Bauhaus dissolves in 1933 with the Nazis coming to power. And so that was the end of Bauhaus. The school was dissolved and the buildings were badly damaged, but they've been obviously since reconstructed. So it only operated for probably a total of 14 years and they graduated fewer than 500 students. But the impact of Bauhaus is something that's still being felt, certainly in later art and even modern design. Now, one of the very interesting teachers at Bauhaus was a man named Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who is usually just called Moholy, who was a Hungarian artist who originally trains in law, and then he wanted to be a writer. He serves in World War I where he was wounded, and after World War I, he decides to pursue the arts, and so he leaves Budapest and he goes to Berlin, which at that point, he goes to Vienna first, then Berlin. Berlin at that point was becoming like it was the sort of New York City's, like it was the center. It was where you wanted to be as an artist. And in 1922, he comes into contact with Gropius, and Gropius invites him to be a teacher at Weimar Bauhaus. Now, while he's at Bauhaus, first of all, he obviously, Gropius saw in him a very sort of common spirit. He was an advocate for abstract art and what we call constructivism, which is, it's this idea of unifying art and applied art, or fine art and applied art, or art and technology. So constructivism looks at the artist the same way it looks at a machinist or an architect or a designer. So very similar philosophy to what we saw at Bauhaus. He was a very interesting artist because he is, in a way, he's what we call idea driven. And some people see him as being sort of a proto-conceptualist artist. It's the idea that is the most important thing. Now, he worked in a lot of different mediums. He originally trains, or at least practices, a more traditional kind of oil painting, or paint on canvas. And then he starts to experiment with different kinds of materials, sort of modern materials. And, applying, paint to different sorts of, plastic surfaces and different kinds of substances. He experiments with photography, and in fact, he seems to come to a very similar method as Man Ray did with his rayogram that we looked at. It seems that within a few months after Ray, he was also experimenting with making cameraless images, which he called photograms. But we also see him, he moves into like theater and theater design. And once he works on this idea of theater design, we get probably what is considered to be his masterpiece, which is this work, Light Prop for an Electric Stage, or a light space modulator. So this really may be our first motorized kinetic sculpture that we have. And that is a really important idea, kinetic art. We haven't used that term yet, but kinetic art is art where motion obviously plays a key role. So it appears as if he had designed this, and he presents it first at an exhibition in 1930 as a mechanism for generating special lighting and motion effects on a stage. In other words, he was designing a machinery to create light effects for an abstract theater. And he did actually make a short film, an experimental film that featured his creation. So the idea is that there is a motor, and once the motor is set in motion, the different reflective materials and forms of this sculpture would cast light around its space because of its reflecting surfaces. They all interact with a beam of light. So it was a new idea, and he made several of these light space modulators. This is the sort of famous one that he makes. It suffered, by the way, from design challenges. He originally, over time, it gets modified. It needed a frame to be added because it was wobbly, and then it needed the motor replaced. It's incredibly fragile. So within a short order, it couldn't really be operated, at least for more than a very short period of time. It was rusting, it would jam, the welds would break. There have been versions of it that have been made, and I'm including on our page a video you can watch of one of these copies of it, a reconstruction of it, so you could see how it ran. And again, his idea here was that he was going to create what he called an architecture of light. Another of the artists associated with Bauhaus was Josef Albers, who was a German artist who first enters Weimar Bauhaus as a student and in 1923 gets promoted to faculty. His job was to teach one of the important foundation courses, and then he also taught furniture design, and he headed up the glass workshop. So he is working on things that were more traditionally seen as craft as opposed to those sort of high art the high art disciplines. Um, he becomes interested in stained glass making even before he enters Bauhaus. So in 1918, his first public commission was to create a church stained glass window for his hometown. But he starts becoming interested in stained glass as a way that you could apply geometric abstraction to the functional environment. You can bring in these problems of light and color into sort of pure geometry. And he invented his own technique, which he referred to as wall glass painting. And originally he's using pieces of glass that he found at the sort of city dump. And he created a technique where he layered and fused or flashed the glass to create these abstract patterns, but all very, very meticulously calculated in this very rigid grid-like system. So this is one of his early glass works, or one of the glass works that we have of his from the from the Bauhaus period. Most of his these wall glass paintings don't survive. And that is sort of the conundrum of glass, because on the one hand, glass is incredibly durable. Like, it doesn't fade and the material doesn't degenerate or decompose, but it's also fragile. So a lot of his works were installed in buildings, and then the windows were destroyed during World War II. And he actually he emigrated to the United States in 1933 when Bauhaus was dissolved by the Nazis, and a lot of his other wall glass paintings were destroyed during shipment to the United States. Interestingly, these works had a later life when he came to New York. Because that picture, which he had called City, and you could see the way that the architecture reflects the sort of grid-like structure, not only of Bauhaus, but also of modern architecture. But again, those long white horizontal strips, and then you could see the way that it relates to even the Bauhaus building by Gropius. But it also echoed the modern city. So he called that first work City. But then it was recreated in 1963 as an enormous 54-foot wide mural in what was then the Pan Am building. But it's now the MetLife building. But it was here, you can see that it's a big painting, and it's actually it's a Formica screen that were placed above the elevators. However, in the year 2000, Manhattan was taken apart and taken to a landfill in Ohio. But it has, in 1919, it was reconstructed in the old Pan Am building, which is now the MetLife building. So they reconstructed Manhattan meticulously following Albert's plans for the work. And they did that in order to sort of celebrate the centennial, the sort of 100-year anniversary of Bauhaus. The Swiss-German artist Paul Klee is another artist who was pretty long associated with Bauhaus. Gropius invited him to join the staff of Bauhaus at Weimar in 1920, and he stayed until 1931. Prior to that, he had already participated in some of the Blaue Reiter exhibitions, which is going to be interesting in a moment. He served in World War I. He is an artist. You could see how varied the artists are who are participating in Bauhaus, because it was really this movement that was covering so many different things. So he's an artist who is very interested in the rudimentary forms of art, which I think you could see also in Albers. There's a sort of simplicity to Paul Klee, in that he's working with lines and points and sort of simple shapes that I would call geometric, but they're also very organic. He's never purely abstract the way that Albers is. It's pure abstraction, and we haven't even talked about this. With Albers, we get to non-objective painting. And we'll talk more about that with the next artist. But in other words, we're now looking at artists whose works, in many cases, have no reference to organic, natural forms in the outside world. Klee is a little bit different because he is seldom completely abstract, and he always does relate his works back to nature. Primarily, he's a draftsman. In other words, drawing is the fundamental sort of underpinning of his art. although color here is always used for sort of the emotion or the mood of the picture. He recorded his notes and his theories. He made publications. He had a 1925 Bauhaus book, which was called Pedagogical Sketchbook, which gave some of his ideas. This is really one of the most engaging works by Paul Klee, which is this small drawing called The Twittering Machine. And it showed how sort of forward-looking Klee was. Klee was really interested in sort of so-called primitive creation. In other words, children, people who are insane, sort of like untrained people had this very pure power to see forms. And from that, he got interested in sort of drawing in a childlike manner. And what he started doing was creating images sort of in an unconscious way. In other words, just letting the pencil or brush move without thought, sort of unconscious, just sort of like an intuitive drawing. And then he would look at the drawing and then sort of use his eye, sort of consciously then turn it into something. So it's the beginning of what we're going to call an automatist technique that we see the surrealists interested in. So the surrealists are interested in this idea of sort of what we call automatic drawing. And Paul Klee is really at the forefront of that idea. So he's pioneering something we're going to see become more important later on. So once he made this unconscious drawing, he would look at it and then he would turn it into something. And so here he turned this sort of very casual series of lines and forms into this twittering machine. And so you could see he's sort of turned it into a sort of an image of a kinetic kind of sculpture, where you could see the hand crank and you could imagine the way the birds would move up and down. You could almost hear the sound. He would give them titles that were based on other sort of associations, or they're sort of entertaining. Sometimes the titles are poetic. Here it just gives a sense of whimsy and sort of a magical sense to it. So that's what Klee's always interested in. He's got this machine aesthetic, but he's combining it with this sense of inner vision and sort of imagination. Now, I will say that though the surrealists sort of claim him as their own, and in the earliest surrealist show, the first surrealist show, Klee's works are included, he wasn't particularly interested, and he himself never talks about the notion of the unconscious. When he talks about this technique, though, he had a wonderful term for it. He called it taking a line for a walk. So Klee wrote, "A line comes into being. It goes out for a walk, so to speak, aimlessly for the sake of the walk." So if you think about the idea of a person taking a dog for a walk, the person has reason and intention, and the dog is instinctive, but they're tied together by this line that then will make its own unpredictable movements. He was incredibly prolific. He made about 8,000 paintings and drawings over the course of his life. And just so you know, if you read the technique here, it says watercolor and pen and ink on oil transfer drawing on paper. So you could see that it's watercolor paint. You could see that very clearly to create those tones. The rest of it, his technique, is he would take a sheet of Japanese paper and with a thin film of black oil paint on it. He would let it dry most of the way, and then he would put it face down onto a paper, like carbon paper. So he would draw on the back of this Japanese paper, and the ink would transfer the line onto the other paper, which is why you have this line that has this sort of granular kind of quality, as opposed to being something that is clean and precise like some of the modern artists we've been looking at. Now, the last artist that I want to talk about that comes it's very much not even associated, but was a fundamental part of the Bauhaus, was Wassily Kandinsky, who we've spoken about before. You remember Kandinsky from Blaue Reiter. And in fact, Paul Klee was also associated briefly with Blaue Reiter. So Kandinsky, as you recall, he's a Russian artist. And after World War I, he returned to Russia, where he came became influenced by Malevich and his suprematist paintings, and there's a video about that for you to watch, and becomes more and more interested in sort of pure geometric form. He returned to Germany in 1921 and comes back into contact with Paul Klee, and he joins the Weimar Bauhaus in 1922, and he becomes one of their most distinguished faculty. So he headed the mural painting workshop, he taught a class on the theory of form, and he stayed at the Bauhaus until the end in 1933 when the Nazi government shut it down, and 57 of Kandinsky's works were confiscated during the purge of degenerate art. So it's interesting to revisit Kandinsky and to see how much his work has changed. He still was very much interested in what he had wrote in 1911 in his book concerning the spiritual in art, but whereas color had been the primary factor of his earlier works, now it was form that was seen as the most expressive. And you can see here how they look different if I put them up side by side. We're still interested in this idea of abstraction, but you remember that Improvisation 28 still had these references to the natural world, to landscape, to the figure on horseback, to this sort of apocalyptic images with subject, and with the work on the right in composition 8, we have reached a work that is purely non-objective, meaning we don't have any reference to the outside world in it. I mean, you can find maybe some forms where geometry and landscape merge. Maybe there's mountains and a sun, but you really can see that it's now purely about geometry and no longer lingering with these associations. You can also see that his style has changed and has become, the brushwork's far less expressive, so it really has this very sort of precision kind of quality to it. On the right. How he comes to non-objective painting, or what we call non-representational art, really comes from two separate stories. The first is when Kandinsky visited an exhibition in 1895 of Impressionist paintings and saw one of Monet's haystacks. And he did not know what the painting was of. And later he said, "It was from the catalog I learned this was a haystack. I was upset I had not recognized it. I also thought that the painter had no right to paint in such an imprecise fashion. Dimly was I aware, too, that the object did not appear in the picture." So this was his first moment where he could look at a picture and he realized that the picture didn't have to have a subject. He says the other moment he came towards sort of accidentally discovering non-representational art was way back in 1910 when he walked into his studio and he said he saw an indescribably beautiful painting all irradiated by an interior light. And he said that he could only see forms and colors and no meaning. And what he saw in his studio was one of his own pictures, but turned on its side. And that's when he began to work completely on these totally abstract works, which no longer needed to look at anything in the world around it. The fact that the titles are musical is also something that we've seen before. We've seen modern artists interested in music, and we certainly could go all the way back to Whistler. By calling his works composition, he's relating forms to sort of the elements that make up music. Forms and color and line are like music, and you can group these elements together and turn them into something abstract and expressive. And this is something that he wrote about, this idea that you could take abstract language and try to create an emotion in a viewer like music does. And Kandinsky wrote, "Form itself, even if completely abstract, has its own inner sound." So now we've got these much more hard-edged forms. You could see that there is this sense of variation to the work that's sort of beautiful, that it has moments that are very dynamic and very sort of much bolder or more aggressive, and some parts that are very calm and quiet and less dense. And that again is all this way of creating a new kind of composition that was not apocalyptic like his earlier work, but instead seemed to represent some sort of harmony. And he thought, though, now what was different about him compared to some of the other Bauhaus artists is he really was interested in the expressive nature and the sort of spiritual nature of these works. And he wrote about how important he thought these forms were. We could look, for example, at the bottom right-hand corner of Composition 8, where we see the circle and triangle sort of engaged together. And Kandinsky wrote about little moments like that. He said, the contact of the acute angle of a triangle with a circle is no less powerful in its effect than that of the finger of God with the finger of Adam in Michelangelo's painting. So here he's referencing this as being as spiritual, as important as the figurative language of the Sistine Chapel. Now, leaving Germany, we're going to look at another architect of this sort of modern tradition. This is the artist Le Corbusier, who is a Swiss artist. He was a painter as well as an architect. And that's going to be, I think, interesting because you might see the relationship between some of these modern architectural forms and painters like Mondrian or even Cubism. But he is an interesting artist. He trains in Paris and Berlin, so we see a lot of his work in France. And he designs different kinds of structures. He designed communal sort of living, sort of like housing projects, this sort of utopian housing projects, but he also designs some single family houses. And we're going to look at one of those, which is the Villa Savoye. Now, we've seen these different mantras for the architects, this idea of, form follows function. He is very famous for his assertion about the house and machinery. And he says, the motor car is a machine for traveling. The aeroplane is a machine for flying. And the house is a machine for living in. Now, this is the Villa Savoye, designed by Corbusier. It is near Paris. It's a single family home. And right off the bat, you can see the differences between this structure and, for example, the Roby house. The first has to do with the relationship of the house to its environment. When we saw the Roby house, we saw a house that was meant to fit it and mirror its setting. If you live in a flat plane, you reflect the flatness of the plane and you spread the house out and absorb the property. Here we see a very different philosophy with Corbusier. And he asserts this idea and he says the house is placed in the middle of a field like an object without disturbing anything. So the house is almost like this spaceship that's landed in a field. It bears no real relationship to the environment, although you'll see that Corbusier is thinking about these things. Now, Corbusier and Gropius are actually both like apprenticed to the same architect as young men, though I think at different moments in time, but they come from the same roots and you can see similarities between them. He's working in ferroconcrete, so steel reinforced concrete and glass and sort of modern materials, not disguised by natural materials the way that Wright did. So he has this much more in common with Bauhaus, and you could see the same interest in these flat planes of sort of white concrete, these horizontal strips of windows, which again has things in common with Bauhaus. And not only that, there is this sense by using these very strong materials, you could create this sense of lightness. And that too is something that Gropius talks about. But he had his own principles for his architect, and this is architect that gets put into a category that we sometimes call international style. At least that was the term given to this kind of architecture in 1932. International style meaning that it's a style that we see throughout Europe or in America. And there are certain characteristics of international style, like the interest in sort of repetitive and modular forms, the elimination of any extraneous decoration or color, like if it's not needed, you don't use it, the preference for machine-made manufactured materials, this interest in visual lightness, and the interest in a sort of open plan, which is something we saw Frank Lloyd Wright use, and something also that we saw in Gropius's Bauhaus building. Now, this particular building is a country home for a woman, and it's quite interesting in that he really demonstrates Corbusier's philosophy of architecture, and he wrote down his 5 points that were necessary for modern architecture. The first one are the pilotis, which is that to achieve this sense of lightness, he wanted the house to be raised on these pillars. And so you could see the main floor of the building is elevated. The lower level has the entrance and the garage. So that's that elevated idea. So these pilotis, which have their reference in classical architecture. And you can see for the way, in a way that this architecture is referencing classical antiquity. Although the pilotis, because he's using steel reinforced concrete, could be very thin. And they were meant to sort of, give this the main support for the building, and they could allow for very open construction in a way that a column, for example, couldn't. And Corbusier was enamored of the Parthenon in Greece. In fact, he was buried with a handful of dirt from the Acropolis, and you could see his drawings of this. So he's referencing the architectural past, even though he's presenting it in a modern way. And in fact, he, in his own writings, compared classical architecture to the automobile, and he was very enamored of the car. So was Frank Lloyd Wright. But again, like with Bauhaus, this idea that machinery and machine technology and fast cars were also part of the sort of artistic expression. And so here he's comparing the design in a very sort of Bauhausian way between ancient architecture and vehicles. And in fact, the driveway and the entire building of the Villa Savoie was built according to the car. So the long driveway comes up under the side of the house. And then as you approach the curving part of the building, if you just cranked your wheel, the design of the house was made on the turning radius of a specific car. So then you would just turn right around the building, and there were 3 garage spaces for cars in this particular structure. Then you would enter in through doors here on the ground floor, and you'd have to move upstairs towards the upper part of the building. His second point for architecture was a roof terrace, which is something we also saw in Gropius's design for the Bauhaus. So this again is the idea of the interior and exterior sort of interpenetrated. And you could see on the top here, you could see a model and the real building. There were also these sort of metal walls to create, again, these ambiguous spaces. Number 3 and number 4 were the free facade and the free plan. So we've already seen the free plan. This is something that Wright was interested in, and so was Gropius. This idea that the interior should have as few supports as possible. So here it's carried to a much greater conclusion. So the pilotis would lead to these ferroconcrete beams, and then the interior was the open floor plan without walls or partitions except how you wanted them. So that was the free plan, and the free facade meant that the walls too should have minimal support so that the facades could be designed in a very free way. And then finally, the ribbon windows, which were characteristic of Corbusier's architecture, as we saw also with Gropius in the Bauhaus, these big rows of horizontal windows. You can see the relationship between, as I said, Corbusier's architecture with these very simplistic, stripped down forms that then could be modularly combined in different ways to modern painting, particularly in something like Mondrian's compositions in that style of Stijl. The interior of the building is actually interesting. Corbusier was playing with different references to architecture. There were ramps as the prime, there were staircases. The primary way of moving through the building were ramps, which, made you feel like you were processing in a way he was guiding you through the house. But ramps are also something we associate with industrial buildings. And by the exterior door, as soon as you walked in, there was actually a sink, which is not only something very industrial, but then also feels vaguely sacred, like you're moving into a holy space. And so he was playing with these different notions of procession, the way you would through a religious building, but also the machine made. Your experience in the Villa Savoye was very controlled. Here you could see the ramps, which, take you on this long, winding route to where he wants you to go. You could see here the choice between the spiral staircase and then the ramp moving up to the second story. At the tops of these ramps and various places throughout the building are very controlled sort of views. And it's an interesting idea. We talk about the way that this building doesn't relate to the exterior, but it does in a way, because he would create these windows in specific places which would block your view except for the view he wanted you to have. In other words, the purpose of this wall up here is only to give you the view he wants you to have of the outside world. And there you could see the plan of the building. Here's the lower ground, and you could see there's the driveway you would come up, and then you would turn your radius and park. There's the 3 spots. Here you could see the ramp up to the second story, the spiral staircase, servants' quarters on the bottom floor, and the laundry guest room. So this is all the unimportant spaces of the house. And then the living spaces are all on that first floor, leading to the terrace, and then there's the ramp all the way up to the rooftop garden. And this is what I meant by the idea of the controlled view. In other words, you could take the ramp up here and have a whole 360-degree view of the exterior, but instead Corbusier is controlling nature with this man-made machine. Madame Savoye, who had the house, did not like her house very much, mostly because it rained. It was not watertight. We saw the same problem with Gropius. If you build a flat top roof, there are inherent problems. And so the Bauhaus leaked, and so did Villa Savoye. And Corbusier didn't really care. Corbusier, didn't pay much attention. He designed this house as a demonstration of his architectural principles, and he kept sending people to come see it. Meanwhile, she was writing to him and saying, it's raining in the hall, it's raining in the ramp, and the wall of the garage is absolutely soaked. What's more, it's raining in my bedroom, which floods every time it rains. And by the time World War II came around, Madame Savoye had already moved into the guest house. She moved out of this house. And this house was very badly damaged during World War II when it was occupied by troops at various times who poured concrete down the plumbing and destroyed the house. But it was restored and turned into a national landmark. Now, by the early 1930s, this international style of modernist architecture had already been defined, and Frank Lloyd Wright got left behind. I think one critic referred to him as the greatest 19th century architect, which of course is quite a dig because it was already the 1930s, and Wright's career was suffering because of it. So Wright, not long after the Villa Savoye, constructed sort of his response to modernist architecture, which was Fallingwater, or the Edgar J. Kaufman House. So the story was Frank Lloyd Wright at this point had been sort of supporting himself by creating a school for architecture. He had this sort of a communal sort of environment, kind of like Bauhaus. He had students who lived and farmed and drew plans. And so he had a group of students, and one was the son of a man named Edgar J. Kaufman, who was a department store owner, manager in Pittsburgh. And maybe he was a manager, I don't know. In any case, Kaufman's son was one of Wright's apprentices and had commissioned Wright to design a house for him and his family, sort of like a house by his favorite waterfall out in the woods. And the story is that Wright sort of ignored the project for quite some time. Like he said, yes, yes, he'll work on it, but he didn't really get anything done. And then all of a sudden, he gets a message from Kaufman saying that he'll be there in a few hours, and Wright sits down to quickly design what would become the house known as Falling Water. It is a shocking and surprising house. For a number of reasons. When Kaufman wanted the house designed, it was in this spot in the woods where he had a cabin overlooking this waterfall. What he didn't expect Wright to do is to design the house on top of the waterfall. He imagined a house that would see the waterfall. But we know how good Wright is at thinking about environment. And so this is a wonderful house for Wright because we see him still being himself and yet addressing modern architecture. Now, what does that mean? We can look at Falling Water next to the Villa Savoy. And of course, Wright knew that the modern language of architecture was white concrete, this pure, no color, no, pure machine-made sort of forms. And you could see Wright addressing that in his building, where you could see he's got these slabs of steel reinforced ferro concrete, right? So he's using the language of Corbusier. And even here, again, this is still Wright. So the central element is an enormous vertical fireplace with horizontals jutting out from it. The vertical fireplace has this Cherokee red, which was one of Wright's signature colors, steel and glass windows, which again are a nod to modernism by using these very visible industrial materials, which otherwise Wright didn't favor. He liked terracotta and stone and brick. But you can still see it's Wright. Unlike Corbusier's The House, is an object in a field, you could see, of course, that Wright is thinking about the way that his house fits and reacts to its environment. So we can look more of the building and we see some elements that we expect from Wright. So the central vertical chimney and fireplace. And then that anchors these horizontal, what he called trays. And these are cantilevered, like the cantilevers we saw at the Roby House, where the supports are all pulled very far in. And that's possible, again, because this is concrete reinforced with steel. Of course, the surprising element of Falling Water was how it dealt with the waterfall. And here you could see that the house is suspended over the waterfall. And the only way that the family was left to actually look at the waterfall was by this very clever element. So coming out of the living room, you'll notice way down here, there's actually a staircase that leads out to over the water. Here you can see the plan. So this is the pier that holds up the water. There's the waterfall, and this is the suspended stairs. Other than that, the plan very much follows Wright's motif. Big open public space, the sort of living room surrounding the fireplace, and then the top floors for a much smaller private space. And here is the staircase that just open up from a hatch, and there was a staircase leading just to this precarious platform over the rushing water. He thought about the way the building related to the house, to the environment in other ways, not just the staircase, but he thought even about the form. The central element of the fireplace is made up of this rock, and even the building itself has this look of stratigraphy. In other words, when you look at rock, you can see the layers in metamorphic rock, like these horizontal bands of stone. He mimics that in the horizontal bands of the architecture. And the building itself moves around the trees, which is rather awesome. This is the driveway where there are these metal fins that abut from the building into the living rock, the natural rock on the other side, to create this sort of canopy. And Wright drew plans of where every tree was on the site and actually goes around the trees so that you can see the way the building is embedded in nature. It has also this idea of the ribbon window, these big horizontal windows that were associated with Corbusier. But here, again, much greater sense of interpenetration. Although we see that in Corbusier's house as well, especially towards the rooftop. But here you could see these big horizontal bands where you're both inside and outside. This is the interior space of the living room, again anchored around the fireplace. You could see the way that Wright has the natural rock of the site sort of penetrate up into the living room to again bring inside and outside together. This, by the way, this red object, that's again his signature color of Cherokee red, is a wine warmer. Like this could swing out over the fire to sort of warm drinks. And you can see the difference now between the aesthetics of Wright on the inside and Corbusier. This is the living room in both buildings. Wright, again, designed all the furniture. Corbusier's is very stripped down. Of course, it doesn't have the furniture it once had, but you can feel the sense of the lack of ornament in Corbusier and how different that is from Wright. So Wright's responding to modernism, but at the same time, he's still keeping the elements of his own aesthetics. And the living room, by the way, was interesting because that is where you could sit and you could hear the fireplace and hear the waterfall without actually seeing it. So that is all we're going to do today, but there are a few videos for you to watch to cover some of the isms we're not getting to, but we'll be back and we'll continue and see what happens as we move into the next decade.